My name is Michael Pangrazio, and I'm with Weta Digital in New Zealand, and my role is art director and also head of the concept department. And my role is primarily to make sure that whenever there's artwork needed that helps aid and define what needs to be built in the pipeline, that's represented from an early stage and worked out. So it can be an efficient process thereafter for people to look at the artwork and be able to understand what it is that they all in their disciplines that they have, you know, from textures to shaders, that it gives them a heads up basically of what to expect, you know, for the shot. Now, not every shot is defined by concept art. Sometimes it's just general sequences, but that's primarily what I do. Yeah, I started around 1978 to 1979, and my first major job was being hired at ILM just after the first Star Wars, and they had moved up to Marin County, and I was a matte painting apprentice there, and so I was introduced to the film industry generally through ILM, and had an opportunity to be that apprentice for about 6 months, and then I feel like I graduated. I guess in substance I did graduate. And a year later I became head of the matte painting department at ILM for about 6 years. But that perspective and that introduction into the film industry gave me a lot of background that I use today from the practical world, the pre-digital world. It's given me a perspective and I think kind of a richer historical context to work from and draw my experience from that helps really today aid me in the digital world. Well, I work in both 2D and 3D. The 3D part of it could be more appropriate, let's say if we're picking up a previs shot or a keyframe that we have to illustrate and define. So we'll take in the geo that was established and we'll pick a frame and we'll kind of paint over it and we'll probably render it again. And I have my own peculiar sort of approach to things, and I have a TD that helps me do all that, so I'm not doing it myself, and I'm working, you know, simultaneously with that person. On that level, I use a lot of 3D. I also sometimes will initiate 3D by having a TD help me create a model. Sometimes my work, there's various demands on the role. Sometimes it's an established shot. Sometimes it might be a pitch, or we serve a director that wants to pitch a project, and we've done that before at Weta. So there's no foundation yet for any of it. So it's purely creative. So there won't be a previs or any storyboards or anything that helps define it for us. So, but I work primarily in both. Sometimes I will purely do 2D. Just depends on what's appropriate. Well, the dynamic of how I work and integrate what I do with the vision of the other members of a team on a project, like a director or a production designer, is maybe a good example would be BFG, and it's a very recent example. I had an opportunity to work with Rick Carter, the production designer on BFG, and work directly with him. Not remotely, of course, you know, we're in New Zealand, but had an opportunity to be able to work directly and get his direct feedback without any inhibiting factors between us and his vision. And I really appreciated and enjoyed that process because it was a very single-minded vision, and I was able to produce work and get pretty much instant feedback. And the thing that surprised me about his approach was his point of view was coming from more feelings than there were any technical requirements to anything. And that was pretty unique amongst visual effects, my visual effects experience, because it's so highly technically driven. So I really enjoyed that experience working with him on BFG and seeing it from an audience's point of view of what they would feel like looking at the work. And what I mean by feeling is all the dynamic psychological factors that go into how people respond to imagery, from color to composition And then factoring in, of course, the emotions of the script. That's very important, and I don't want to ever understate that. That to me is one of the primary things. If you can crack that nut and get that working for people, I think that's my goal at least. That's a marvelous part of my job. I have a process of an impression that I get when I read some text, or I have a storyboard, and of course just a line drawing, so it doesn't define color or anything like that. But I have in my mind, especially after reading the text of what the scene represents, I have a very vague, amorphous idea of what it could look like. I probably put my own personality and project whatever it is that I think it should look like, which is it's an interesting situation because everybody looks at a text or an image that isn't so defined clearly and sees their own personal vision of it. There's a personal aspect to looking at something. We all use our own imagination to define it. So this is where a director does the same thing. So he's got his view of it. He's got within his own mind. You've got your own view of it within your own mind. So I think the process is one of being very sensitive to pleasing the director, who I always think is the top of the pyramid. But the process I go through is almost like a Rorschach test. In other words, what I do is I have this preconceived idea, but it's very vague. I start gathering reference. Reference is the foundation of what I do. And sometimes I'll overlay in 2D. I'll overlay a lot of different images, and I'll start to see something in them that I feel is appropriate. And what I mean by Rorschach is that I'm reacting to something that's amorphous and not very clearly defined in my own personal way. And I'm seeing that, and I draw it out. And it could solve one problem of the multitude of problems that you have to solve to get it to be representing the shot in a clear way, or representing the imagery that you need as a final version to submit to somebody to say, hey, we think this is what it could look like. So I go through this cycle of this process of this is the point I want to make, is that I never know quite where it's going to end up. There's these borders that are established by the requirement of the scene, and I stay within that. And there's a discipline within it, but there's a lot of chaos in between, trying to find. It's a journey of discovery, really, of what it is going to end up. And it surprises me. And if I have 10 minutes left before I have to submit something, I'm still reworking it, looking for something to make it better. I think it's both. Sometimes it's very early on, right at the beginning of the process. And I'm very gratified for that, because if it's front-loaded, it means that it's probably more relevant through the whole process thereafter. And I just feel I'm kind of a believer, a true believer in that art and the modus operandi of using art is really a very efficient way to solve the problems of visual effects, especially for big companies that have a big overhead, and they need to get that look nailed down quickly and then start working on implementing that and getting an approval by a director, from an early stage. And I think concept art is a really inexpensive way to solve that problem. But sorry, I forgot the question.
Where do you start and stop?
Sometimes it's very pre-production. If there isn't even a script, like I was saying before, sometimes we aid an individual who wants to pitch a project to a studio. That happens, and I love that sort of work because it's so creative and it's so open. We're defining what things could look like. So it could start from that point of view. Most of the time, the average is we're receiving information, packs of information from reference to pre-design concept art from a client that has hired Weta to do their effects. So we're taking in all that information and we're supplementing it, because there's always holes. It's a complex, of course, everybody knows how complex it is to make a movie. So there's always an opportunity to embellish on what we've been provided by for a client. And that would be a role that we play all the way through the whole process. But mostly it's preloaded, I think. That's probably, if I were to average it, we do a lot of work at the beginning. To me, color is something I'm discovering all kinds of things about. I discovered the other day that yellow is a color when you see it, like a chrome yellow, a very pure yellow, that your brain actually secretes serotonin, which gives you this feeling of well, I wouldn't say it's euphoria, but it gives you a feeling of well-being. And this amuses me to think about this, because as an example, you know how popular the happy face was, especially during the 70s and 80s. And that was a bright chrome yellow, that same shade, with this big smile on it as an iconic shape. And that became popularized all the way around the world. And I think that there's something to it scientifically. It's not just an accident that became popular, but color is something that I'm discovering more and more about and trying to factor that in the psychology of it. Not every color makes us, secretes a chemical in our brain, but people react to color differently. And of course, there's color scripts that define moods, of overall sequences and things like that. So I just think it's so valuable and so important to support the characters and the moods of the scene. Lighting is, to me, I would say that it's one of the, if you have a stool and a stool needs 3 legs, I think lighting is one, color, lighting, composition. I think that stool stands up when it has all 3 of them working right. And lighting, to me, is one of the most important things. You're presenting something. When I was young, I had the benefit of going to a lot of photography studios and seeing photographers who would do catalogs with very mundane objects like toasters, or slippers or clothes or something. But they would light these things and make them look exquisite, even though they were mundane objects. So I noticed that lighting can sell things. Lighting presents things to people. It attracts the eye. It features things. It makes it dimensional or it makes it flat. It creates a mood. And so lighting, to me, is just, like I say, it's about 1/3 of, in terms of importance of presenting something that's very effective. And I love the idea of controlling these different tools in order to, you're really manipulating people in a way, but for entertainment purposes, of course, it's very harmless, but you're manipulating them, and I just love discovering the secrets of how people react to things visually.